Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the first adult education session to be taking place in the Shul since March 2020. We've had many successful events since then on Zoom and YouTube, but people have told me how much they have been looking forward to a return to live events, and in the future, most of our talks will take place here in either the Beit Midrash or the hall. The program from October to next Pesach includes 11 sessions. All 7 talks are scheduled to be in the shul, and only the 4 cantoral events will be online since Chazanot attracts an international audience. We open tonight with a talk by one of our Edgware United Synagogue members, Phil Brown, on the Boys from Back Streets, the Jewish East End. He was born in Stepney in London's East End in the mid-1950s. He was brought up in a large traditional Jewish family in humble surroundings. In his formative years, he attended the Oxford and St George's Youth Club in Henriques Street. His religious instruction took place at the Talmud Torah Synagogue in Christian Street. Left school with no formal education at 14 years of age, and his working life started as an apprentice at jeweler in Hatton Garden. At the age of 17, Phil moved onto the street market in ladies' fashion. In the early 20s, he took his first examination, the Knowledge of London, and passed out as a London cab driver, and he's still active in the cab trade. Phil's passion for London's history played a huge role in his later life. Studying at the City University and the Guildhall in the City of London, he enrolled onto tourist guide courses and qualified in 2001. Since then, he has been bespoke walking tours across the metropolis. He also lectures on the capital's social history. He has appeared on BBC television and radio and is also a published article writer. Phil began making short film documentaries in 2007. He was extremely surprised when his film, The Golden Highway, based on the River Thames, was selected by the British Film Institute as best film in its category. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much, Spencer, for that nice introduction. Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Spencer for inviting me to Edgware Synagogue tonight. Before I begin tonight's lecture, can I have a show of hands for those who were born in the East End or whose families originated from London's Eastern Quarter? That's quite a few of you, I should imagine. And I should imagine there's some wonderful stories to tell, but we'll leave that for later. Even though I was born in the latter period of the Jewish presence in the East End, I still have vivid memories of its Jewish identity. I recall the many synagogues where the community worshipped, the toxic smell of cloth and leather associated to the rag trade, and the crowded street markets. My religious instruction took place at the Talmud Torah in the aptly named Christian Street. Here, Hebrew classes took place 5 times a week, and you had to attend. The synagogue was turned into a mosque in the 1980s, reflecting the ever-changing melting pot of nations in the East End. When I'm engaged in my research in this location, I always reminisce my formative years. I remember holding my mother's hand as we walked along the cobblestones of Hessel Street Market, particularly on a Friday afternoon before the evening Sabbath. The aroma of baked collars, pickled cucumbers, and gefilte fish still salivates my palate. This was my Jewish East End. They were truly days from a different world. The East End has been a home for the Jewish community since the 18th century. Within the boundaries of this small enclave, an overcrowded diaspora lived, worked, and followed their religious beliefs. For the multitudes of the people of the book, it was a humble existence where the lack of food and shelter were constant companions. Arriving from Eastern Europe after a hazardous voyage, where they had left persecution behind for a better life, these weary immigrants disembarked at Irongate Stairs on the north side of the River Thames, close to the Tower of London. This was their point of arrival to London's Eastern Quarter, a hinterland that would be their home for the duration of their lives. They had found their very own shtetl in a foreign land. The first generations of settlers lived cheek by jowl and expected their children to replicate their own lives. The well-trodden path of employment was already mapped out for Jewish adolescents. Dexterity, in all its various forms, would occupy the working lives of the children of the ghetto. In the infamous sweatshop as a machinist, tailor, or presser, costermongers in the street markets, or simply peddlers selling their wares door to door. However, a small group of individuals dispelled the myth of the unskilled Jewish worker. Their panacea was to step out of the shadows of conformity and take the path of sport, the arts, and literature. The three protagonists that will feature in this evening's lecture were merely the boys from the back streets. Therefore, let us put Daniel Mendoza, Mark Gertler, and Isaac Rosenberg under the spotlight. Daniel Mendoza was born on the eastern perimeter of the commercial city of Aldgate. His ancestors were of Spanish and Italian descent, which classified him as a Sephardic Jew, meaning those that had originated formerly from the Iberian Peninsula. Mendoza was from a typical large East End family, which included 7 children. His religious and secular education took place within the confines of Bevis Marks Synagogue in Aldgate, Britain's oldest surviving synagogue. At 13 years of age, the youthful Mendoza was sent out into the workplace. His first job was as a shop assistant, aiding a fellow Jew who owned a greengrocer's store in Whitechapel Road. The meager wages that Mendoza earned was welcomed by his parents to aid the family household. The young adolescent's first altercation was with a gathering of unsuspecting local youths who taunted his employee's wife at his place of work. Mendoza wrote in his memoirs, "I became the terror of these ragged local gangs. Although I was only a youngster, I was ready to come forward in the defense of my governor's wife, who was about to be molested. The assailants felt the full force of my clenched fists. The impact from my brute force astounded me. The foray all happened so quickly. As the unruly youths slowly rose to their feet, I saw blackened eyes and bloodied noses. They ran like the wind and out of sight." There were many other instances where the young Mendoza would step forward to protect his fellow brethren from insult and provocation. In Mendoza, the Jewish East End had found a true lion of Israel. The prospect of becoming a boxer was by now firmly cemented in Mendoza's mind. The daily chore spurred on the young pretender on to establish himself as a boxer. He thought to himself, if I am good with my fists, perhaps I can find fame and fortune through fighting. Even though this East End kid had a slight frame, which only measured 5'7" and he only weighed 160 pounds. He weighed 60 pounds. At 23, Mendoza married his first love, Esther. A rapid succession of children followed year after year, eventually totaling 9 offspring. There were by now many mouths to feed, which meant that Mendoza needed to ply his trade as a pugilist without delay. In 1789, Mendoza the Jew, as he was billed professionally, emerged from a series of prize fights held in Stepney and Leytonstone. He went on to become the champion of England. Before the Queensberry rules were implemented, it was commonplace for 2 antagonists to fight with bare knuckles in a makeshift open ground, surrounded by a huge gathering of bloodthirsty spectators. There were no weight limits in the early days of boxing. Often the meek and the mighty would fight in an atmosphere which turned the contest into a satirical event. The larger man, at most times, would often knock the smaller opponent into oblivion. Mendoza was not like the brutes that he fought. His technique offered neat footwork, sidestepping his rival, bobbing and weaving whilst throwing punches to the face and body and then retreating. He would frustrate opponents who found it hard to lay a blow on Mendoza's small body. This new unorthodox style of boxing brought a kind of scientific aspect to the sport, which had never been seen before. It is true to say that Mendoza invented the concept in which every contemporary boxer has adapted today. Mendoza's boxing career took place from 1780 to 1790, and of the many fights that the Cockney boy fought, there are few that take pride of place. 3 bouts with the reigning champion and his former mentor, Richard Humphreys, the outcome being 1 defeat and 2 victories. In the final contest, Mendoza was the victor and became heavyweight champion of the world, even though he was classed as a middleweight. In 1795, Mendoza lost his crown to John Jackson, who was 4 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier. So great was the interest in Mendoza's accomplishments, George and London became obsessed with the East End boxer whose exposure in the newspapers was richly deserved. Mendoza was by now a London celebrity and was recognized wherever he went. However, the income from his greatest triumphs only sustained the pugilist and his large family for a short period of time. The bailiffs were always in close proximity to Mendoza, whose finances were always in the red. At times, when his income dried up, his creditors found him incarcerated at Her Majesty's pleasure. Friends were always on hand to bail the pugilist out. Mendoza would have to find other sources of income to maintain a decent standard of living. In due course, he became a landlord at the Admiral Nelson Public House in Whitechapel. A few years later, he opened a boxing academy at the Lyceum in the Strand, mostly teaching upper-class rakes how to look after themselves. There were many other ventures, including touring the British Isles, giving boxing demonstrations, appearing in pantomimes, and working as a recruiting sergeant. In his lifetime, Mendoza had made and spent a fortune. He had climbed the mountain of success and reached the peak, gradually to decline back into a normal life of limited expectations. His boxing days were all but over, even though at the age of 56, he came out of retirement to fight a grudge match against Tom Owen on Banstead Downs. The aging boxer was sadly defeated in 12 rounds. The huge crowd of spectators cheered the fallen hero as he made his way back to his awaiting carriage. The aged Cockney boy had peered out of the window of his carriage. His emotions had got the better of him. Tears rolled down his face as the reality of leaving the public gaze and realizing his boxing days were finally over. Daniel Mendoza had achieved much fame in his lifetime and became a hero of the East End. He was an inspiration to those who would turn the other cheek and walk away if confronted with aggression. In a sense, he had toughened up his co-religionists to fight back when faced with confrontations. Perhaps his greatest triumph was not in the boxing ring, but a formal invitation by King George III at Windsor Great Park. Mendoza wrote in his memoirs, "Never in my wildest dreams did I ever envisage meeting the king. In conversations with His Royal Highness, I was amazed that he had taken so much interest in my boxing career and was extremely knowledgeable on the subjects. After a sumptuous tea and fine pastries, the meeting was concluded. Making my way back to London in the King's coach, I thought to myself, here I was, a boy born in the back streets of Aldgate, walking along the lush green lawns of Windsor with the King himself." To honour Mendoza's achievements, an English heritage blue plaque adorns a residence where the great boxer lived. This symbolic token of remembrance can be seen at 3 Paradise Road, E2, a narrow cobblestone pathway at the junction of Bethnal Green Road and Cambridge Heath Road. Here Mendoza wrote The Art of Boxing. Mendoza died in 1836 and was laid to rest in the now disused Nueve Cemetery behind Queen Mary College in Mile End Road, E1. 2 decades later, he was reinterred in Brentwood Jewish Cemetery. Some years ago, the late Sir Henry Cooper unveiled a bronze plaque at the grave of the distinguished boxer, a fitting tribute from one luminary to another. Mendoza's legacy has continued. In 1954, the boxer was elected to the Boxing Hall of Fame. Daniel Mendoza had planted the seeds in which future generations of boxers would step into the ring and apply the methods of pugilism as an art form. The East End has a strong reputation for producing famous boxers. Perhaps the social conditions dictate this Cockney tradition. Mendoza was charismatic, brave, foolhardy, and achieved in his lifetime's ambitions, and he truly cast a giant shadow over London's East End. Our second protagonist, I'm not sure if you know who he is, Mark Gertler. The East End has always been a place where social history has dominated the lives of its humble residents. At the turn of the 20th century, the population of London's Eastern Quarter could only look forward to a life of hardship and limited opportunities. However, there were a few individuals who managed to lift themselves out of obscurity and escape their modest roots. One such personality that emerged from the shadows of the East End was Mark Gertler, a man who went on to become a renowned modernist painter. Gertler was a shining example for those who had self-belief to rise above one's expectations. The East End boy showed courage and conviction to dream the dream and escape the playground of his youth. Mark Gertler was born in Spitalfields, the son of Jewish immigrants who had emigrated from Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. The Gertlers were a typical East End family, adopting the harshness of life's reality in this neighborhood, where poverty was the accepted rule. Gertler had 4 other siblings to contend with, which meant that education was at a premium, and the certainty of the garment factory or the market stall loomed on the horizon. Whilst in his infancy, Gertler was never seen without a pencil or a sketch pad in his hands. Encouraged by his mother, who realized that her youngest son showed artistic promise and determination in his early years. At most times, Gertler would sit on a chair with his head pressed up against the bedroom window for hours, observing the images that came into his view. Young Gertler portrayed men, women, dogs, cats, which became his subjects that filled the pages of his sketchpad. It was clear, even at this tender age, Gertler was destined to break away from the modest enclave which captivated his formative years. After leaving school, Gertler enrolled into art classes at the Regent Street Polytechnic. This was an unusual occurrence, as the offspring of the working classes rarely attended any form of further education. Indeed, the student artist had to leave the college after only 1 year due to the continued hardships placed on his parents' finances. This episode in young Gertler's life was a huge disappointment. The reality of becoming an artist was slowly fading away. To sustain his welfare, Gertler took a job in a stained glass factory, which paid for his upkeep and also provided assistance to the family household. He despised his employment in the glass factory, which became bearable upon his return to evening classes at the Polytechnic, where his passion for the arts gathered momentum. At 17 years of age, Gertler was placed 3rd in a national art competition. Upon this achievement, Gertler applied for a grant from the Jewish Education Society. The application was successful and released the funds required as the aspiring artist to enroll into the renowned Slade School of Art incorporated at the University College in Bloomsbury. Here, Gertler excelled as a student of the arts, and the promise he had shown from an early age was about to be fulfilled. Gertler was no different from all the creators of the art form. Perhaps this bohemian lifestyle has always affected those who lived in the world of illusions. Gertler was encompassed in this mindset and would embark on many romantic interludes mixed with black days of depression. It was at the Slade School of Art that he met a fellow student called Dora Carrington, a young belle who became a permanent fixation and obsession of the painter's desires. Carrington was already married and out of reach of Gertler's love and devotion. This had a devastating effect on Gertler's well-being, which led to the artist purchasing a revolver and threatening to commit suicide. Only this time, Gertler came to his senses to avoid an early death. After Gertler had completed his studies at the Slade School of Art, he immediately put his creative talent into action, painting scenes from East End life, some that depicted the cynicism that the working classes felt for their political masters. In the early 1900s, the politics in the East End was a hotbed of radicalism. Socialists, communists, and fascists all staked their claim on this domain. As the political storm clouds gathered, these fledgling ideologies became the dictate for painters, poets, and writers to air their political views. Gertler was by now becoming noticed in artistic circles and classified as a bright and passionate painter. He became acquainted with Lady Ottoline Morell, a leading light in the newly formed Bloomsbury Group, fashioned as a group of free thinkers whose aims were to create and nurture freedom of expression within the arts. This was to the detriment of traditionalists who condemned the group's new approach. T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf were patrons. T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf were patrons of this newfound idealism. In 1914, Britain was engaged in the Great War. The carnage on the battlefields of France and Belgium saw the slaughter of England's brave young men, whose blood covered the European landscape. The predicted march to victory became a harsh reality in which 4 years of stalemate between the warring nations wiped out an entire generation. The graphic images which appeared in the daily papers overwhelmed Gertler, who condemned the inhuman, senseless slaughter. It was not long before the painter became a prominent pacifist and conscientious objector, and was inspired to paint his greatest work, The Merry-Go-Round. The painting was a cynical view of uniformed soldiers on colourful carousel at a fair. Gertler's painting depicted the continuation of the circle of violence and bloodshed. The government frowned upon the painting. However, amongst the artistic fraternity, the controversial picture was held as one of the finest modernist works of art in years. Gertler's commission continues to keep his reputation as a fine artist intact. His later works had a darkened bleakness which was influenced by ill health. Aged 29, Gertler was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease which forced the artist to enter a sanitarium during the 1920s and 30s. The complexities of Gertler's eccentric lifestyle continued to haunt his creative mind. In 1930, he married Marjorie Hopkinson, an ill-fated marriage doomed to failure. A son named Luke was born a few years later. The artist was at most times unbearable and unable to perform the duties of husband, and his mood swing kept his wife in a constant state of fear. Gertler's declining health was by now having an impact on his daily life. His appearance became increasingly disheveled. He was unshaven, wore ill-fitting clothes, and the stench of alcohol on his breath made him a person best to be avoided. The downhill struggle continued unabated. By 1936, the East End painter was unable to get any commissions, which led to financial hardships. His wife could take no more, and Julie left. The two women that had inspired Gertler's early life were now dead. His only true love, Dora Carrington, had committed suicide, and his lover mother had died. The ailing painter finally succumbed to his tormented mind. Gertler could take no more and carefully planned his fait accompli. Alone, desperate, and deluded, he locked himself in his Highgate studio and gassed himself. He is buried in Willesden Jewish Cemetery. Mark Gertler had begun life in humble surroundings. Perhaps he had a natural talent and self-belief and was lucky enough to be inspired by his devoted mother. This narrative is truly a remarkable story of an East End boy who rose above his expectations. The next time you're in the vicinity of Commercial Street, take a walk down Elder Street and stop when you get to number 32. This is the house where the young Gertler spent his formative years. Close your eyes and imagine a young boy with a sketch pad in one hand and a pencil in the other. Even though the demons of self-doubt got the better of Gertler, he had a dream to follow his passion, which nurtured his soul. Today, Gertler's paintings are most sought after. They often fetch huge sums of money under the hammer at the leading auction houses across the world. Our final protagonist is Isaac Rosenberg. Have you heard of Isaac Rosenberg? Nods off the head, I can get him. Okay. My final protagonist from the back streets of the East End is Isaac Rosenberg, a young man whose life was cut short in the horrors of the First World War. He was immortalized for his somber poems from his experiences in the trenches at the time of the Great War. Isaac was born in 1890 to Eastern European parents who came from Lithuania. His family lived in the poor district of Bristol. His father was a peddler selling his wares door to door. A small Jewish community was in existence in Bristol. They maintained a low profile in the larger Gentile population. Isaac's father realized that to preserve the family's Jewish identity, they would have to move to London's East End. Here they would be amongst their fellow brethren and be able to uphold their religious convictions. Isaac was by now 7 years old and attending St. Paul's Primary School. From an early age, he showed good aptitude towards education. His school reports were exemplary, which encouraged his parents to believe that at least one of their siblings had a natural talent for education. Rosenberg Senior School was the Baker Street Board School in Stepney. The school had a large Jewish presence. As a meticulous student, Isaac received a Good Conduct Award. This recognition allowed him to take evening classes at the Arts and Crafts Institute in Stepney Green. It was at this establishment Rosenberg's creativity was exposed, learning the proficiencies of painting, sculpturing, and literature. The young student had found his true calling to the arts. Rosenberg spent all his time in the newly opened Whitechapel Library, known as the University of the Ghetto, a product of Canon Samuel Barnett and the philanthropist Passmore Edwards. Barnett brought education to the East End in his settlement building at the Toynbee Hall in Commercial Street. At the Whitechapel Library, the undiscovered talent of London's Eastern Quarter would immerse themselves in the pages of literature. From behind the facade of the Whitechapel Library, fledgling writers and artists flourished. The playwrights Arnold Wesker and Bernard Cox, historian Jacob Boronsky, and Mark Gertler, the painter, were alumni of this storehouse of allegories. At the age of 15, Rosenberg was thrust into the workplace. He attained employment as an apprentice engraver under Karl Hirschschull in Hatton Garden. Although now contributing to the family finances, Rosenberg was still deeply motivated to further his education. It was at the Birkbeck College, then in Fleet Street, that he studied poetry and visual arts at evening classes after work. The young Rosenberg excelled in the creative arts and came to the attention of the principal at the Birkbeck College. He arranged for 3 Jewish benefactors to provide funds to sponsor the young artist to attend the renowned Slade School of Art in Bloomsbury. In this environment, Rosenberg was in good company. His fellow students included David Boomberg, Paul Nash, and Mark Gertler. 3 years of study and a degree obtained from the Slade provided the competence for Rosenberg to pursue a career in the arts. By 1912, he was an exhibitor at the Whitechapel Art Gallery and a published poet. He wrote 10 poems collated in a pamphlet called Night and Day. This is an excerpt from Night and Day. I lay upon the sparkling grass, and God's own mouth was kissing me, and there was nothing that did not pass, but blazed with divinity. As a child, Rosenberg had suffered breathing difficulties. This was confirmed by doctors in later life to be chronic bronchitis. In 1914, he relocated to the warmer climate of South Africa, where his sister Minnie lived in Cape Town. Whilst here, his health improving, Rosenberg heard the depressing news of the outbreak of the First World War. Although not a pacifist, Rosenberg detested the horrors of war. On his sabbatical, he composed a series of anti-war poems, including Daughters of War. Isaac returned to Britain in 1915 to follow his career as an artist and poet. Unable to find any commissions and low on finance, Rosenberg made the supreme sacrifice and enlisted in the army in October 1915. He asked for his pay to be sent to his mother. His artistic friends asked why he had joined the army. Rosenberg replied, I never joined the army for patriotic reasons. Nothing can justify war. I suppose we must all fight to get the trouble over with. Isaac was at home with his family in Dempsey Street, Stepney, when his papers for enlisting in the army arrived. Isaac recalled, it was a day I shall never forget. It was Saturday, being the Sabbath, the family were preparing to go to synagogue. Sitting round the table, enjoying a hearty breakfast, we were all in a jovial mood. Mother always excelled on the Sabbath. Her pancakes and baked challah were exceptional. As the tea was being poured from the silver teapot, I heard the sound of the letterbox. The early morning post had arrived. I rushed to the door to retrieve the letters on the doormat. My father screamed out, is there anything for me, Isaac? No, I said. It's a solitary letter addressed to me from the Ministry of Defence. As I sat down, I saw the whole mood of the family change. Reading out the details of my enlistment papers, a complete silence filled the sullen atmosphere. As I looked up, I saw my mother and father sitting at the other end of the table, their faces in a state of apprehension. The memory of my mother's tears falling down her cheeks will stay with me for the rest of my days. Rosenberg was assigned to the 12th Bantam Battalion of the Suffolk Regiment. A bantam referred to the men being under a minimum height of 5'3" tall. Isaac was finally accepted by the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment. In June 1916, he was sent to serve on the Western Front in France. He continued to write poetry while serving in the trenches. His tangible presence on the battlefields evoked all the manifestations of the killing fields of Europe. Poems from the trenches included break of day, returning we hear the larks and dead man's dump. This is an excerpt from Break of Day in the trenches. What do we see in our eyes? At the shrieking iron and flame, hold through still heavens, what quaver, what heart aghast, poppies whose roots are in man's veins, droop and ever drooping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with dust. Throughout the conflict, Rosenberg had many bouts of illness and was confined to field hospitals. On recovery, he returned to his duties as a soldier. Even though he was fighting for king and country, Rosenberg experienced many encounters of anti-Semitism, especially from the officers. This did not deter him from carrying out his duties. On the 21st of March, 1918, the German army started its spring offensive. Rosenberg was assigned to the King's Own Royal Regiment, who was stationed in the town of Frompe. The regiment came down under heavy bombardment from German mortars. The hostilities quietened down at nightfall. On the 1st of April 1918, having just finished night patrol, Rosenberg was killed by a sniper's bullet. Isaac was only 27 years old. He was buried in a mass grave, but in 1926, his unidentified remains of 6 soldiers from the King's Own Royal Engineers were individually reinterred in Ballet High Road East Cemetery. Rosenberg's gravestone is marked with the Star of David. Beneath are the words, artist and poet. Perhaps one of Rosenberg's most famous poems was The Immortals. I killed them, but they would not die. Yeah, all the day and all the night. For them I could not rest and sleep, nor guard from them, nor hide in flight. Then in my agony I turned, and made my hands red in their gore. In vain, for faster than I slew, they rose more cruel than before. I killed them with slaughter mad. I killed them with all my strength was gone, and still they rose to torture me. For devils only die in fun. I used to think the devil hid in women's smiles and wine's carouse. I called him Satan, Beelzebub, but now I call him Dirty Louse. Isaac Rosenberg was a talented individual, a boy from the back streets of Stepney, whose young life was cut short in a foreign field. Born of immigrant parents, he went on to study the arts and cast a huge shadow over London's East End. His legacy lives on. Critics have named him one of the greatest wartime poets. 2 self-portraits adorn the walls of the National Portrait Gallery and the Tate Gallery. An English heritage plaque outside the Whitechapel Library commemorates the place Isaac studied in his youth. This evening's lecture has focused on 3 East End luminaries. They were born in the back streets of London's East End. Mendoza, Girdler, and Rosenberg were talented individuals who persisted in following their aspirations. Their attributes changed the shape of their humble lives. Tonight, we have remembered them, and their legacies will remain for perpetuity. The Jewish nation has always led a nomadic existence. The diaspora in London's East End has always created interest for social historians. This peripatetic existence continued into the suburbs of the capital in the latter half of the 20th century. In the subconscious of our minds, we cannot escape from our past experiences. Our ancestral roots are firmly embedded in our souls and will remain for perpetuity. You can take the boy or girl out of the East End, but you can't take the East End out of the boy and girl. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any questions at all? I'd be pleased to answer.
could you go to, we don't seem to have a roving microphone, so could you go there?
Hold on.
I've got a lot of comments to make. I actually taught in the East End and I saw how the Jewish people left. We then got the Greek Cypriots and they left, and then we got the Bangladeshis. And it said that when the Jewish people left the East End, they moved out in straight lines. That's why a lot of them landed up in Southend and came to northwest London, because it was all on a straight line from the East End. And there's so many other things that I'd like you to investigate. There was Lou Gray, who also came from the East End, who rose to great providence.
Don't forget his brother, and they were dancers as well.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
Joe
and
Loss.
and they lived in Bethnal Green. Yeah.
Yes,
I know the story.
so many of them came. We must be proud of our ancestors and what they achieved just by the coming from the East End, and also gratitude to the Whitechapel Library that you mentioned.
Which was shocking. Well, thank you for those comments. As you know, if you wanted me to talk, I can talk to them probably next week. But tonight it was only 50 minutes. But if the show would like me back again, I'll be very pleased to come back and talk about some of the things that you spoke about. Because I've covered extensively everything that you actually asked me there. Yeah. But tonight I could only cover 3. Okay. Any more questions at all? Yes. You're going to have to come up.
Come on.
And then I changed and I taught mostly children and Thomas.
East End of London, actually, it was a place that it created a lot of progressive people.
Mhm.
And then the culmination was the Battle of
Cable Street,
1936. Yeah.
1936. There's a mural in Cable Street,
It's
yeah.
very important.
Yeah.
In Jewish history,
But you've got to realise tonight, we had a lecture tonight. If you want me to come back, right into the synagogue, and I'll give you an hour. Any more questions, please? I'll be pleased to take another one. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Okay.
Well, maybe I can ask one question.
Okay.
Clearly, the East End wasn't just Jewish, there were other people there. Could you have done a talk on the non-Jewish people and some of these boys from back streets rising above their poverty?
Well, if you want to listen to the next lecture, I've got one on the East London Saints. That's Dr. Bernardo, William Booth, and Samuel Barnett.
Right.
If you want me to come again, we'll do that one next time.
Well, I'd like to thank Phil for his fascinating, detailed and well-researched talk tonight.
I'm sure it will have refreshed many memories among our audience of the former Jewish East End, and possibly stimulated a desire to go on one of your bespoke walking tours. Our next session is in 3 weeks' time on Tuesday, the 15th of November. There's a change of programme from the session advertised in the biannual programme. We shall have the rare opportunity of welcoming Fleur Hassan Nahum, the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, who is currently in charge of foreign relations, international economic development and tourism. She is also the co-founder and founding member of the UAE Israel Business Council. We shall reschedule Professor Irving Taylor's talk on medicine in the Bible and beyond and let you know the revised date as soon as it's available. You can find the current complete biannual programme by clicking on the front page of the weekly Edgeware highlights. Thank you for this evening, and I hope to see you at our future sessions.